Don't let her die out there. The insurgent commander pressed his radio to his lips and laughed at the silence that answered him. 40 men on the mountain. One Canadian position, compromised, bleeding. His best shooter had just gone quiet mid-transmission, and nobody on his frequency could explain why. He scanned the ridgeline through his scope and saw nothing. No muzzle flash, no movement, no trace of whoever was dismantling his operation one careful shot at a time. The woman behind that rifle wasn't in any intelligence file. She was supposed to be running ballistic calculations from a trailer. Petra Vance had a system for error. Not the kind of error that showed up in after-action reports or got flagged in quarterly reviews. The small, invisible kind, the rounding discrepancy in a trajectory calculation, the half degree of angle that separated a hit from a miss at 800 meters, the thermal variable that most people folded into their margin of tolerance and forgot about. Petra didn't forget about anything. She was 27 years old, and she worked in a climate-controlled trailer at Canadian Forces Base Gagetown, New Brunswick. And her job was to find the errors that other people had already decided were acceptable. Her official designation was Artillery Survey Technician. In plain language, that meant she calculated where shells would land before anyone fired them, accounting for barrel wear, propellant temperature, atmospheric pressure, the rotation of the Earth at the specific latitude of the engagement, and a dozen other variables that most people in her line of work had stopped thinking about carefully somewhere around year 3. Petra was in year 4, and she had not stopped thinking about any of them. Her section commander, Chief Warrant Officer Dale Sherwood, had noticed her approximately 3 weeks into her first posting. Not because of her work, which was excellent and therefore unremarkable in a unit that only noticed work when it went wrong. What caught his attention was what she did on her lunch breaks. She would walk to the far end of the range, not to shoot, because that wasn't her role, and she would stand at the backstop with a small notebook and watch the training teams run their sessions. Not casually, with the specific absorbed attention of someone who was not watching a performance, but solving a problem. Sherwood was 53 years old, and he had spent 31 of those years in the Canadian Artillery. He had the look of a man who had been worn smooth by decades of wind and cold, and the particular patience of a discipline that measured success in millimeters, at distances where a millimeter was everything. He knocked on her trailer door on a Tuesday afternoon in February, which in New Brunswick meant the world outside was white and silent and brutal in the specific way of maritime winter that doesn't announce itself with drama, but simply settles in and stays. "Vance," he said. She looked up from her workstation. She had a pencil behind her ear, her father's habit, an engineer from Sudbury who had kept one there every day of his working life until the end. She kept it in the same way you keep a habit that belongs to someone else, carefully so it doesn't wear down. "Chief," she said, "the thermal drift calculation on the Excalibur rounds from last week's exercise. The reported variance is being attributed to propellant batch inconsistency, but I think it's something else." He didn't ask what else. He looked at her for a moment the way he looked at everything, not evaluating exactly but reading. The particular quality of attention that 31 years of very precise work builds in a person. "What do you do for fitness in the mornings?" he said. She blinked. The shift was deliberate. She adapted to it. 6 kilometers, then circuit work. "Why?" "I run at 0530, he said. "You can come if you want." She looked at him for a moment. "Is that an order?" "No," he said. "It's an invitation. There's a difference." He paused in the doorway. "You ever heard of Master Corporal Dennis LeBeau?" She shook her head. He was a fire support technician. Convoy got hit in the Panjwai district 2009. Both FOOs were incapacitated. LeBeau pulled the fire mission himself, calculated the corrections under fire, talked the rounds onto target, held off the contact for 14 minutes until the QRF arrived. Saved 6 people. Sherwood stopped. Let that settle the way he let most things settle, long enough to matter. LeBeau had never run a live fire mission in a combat environment before that day, but he'd spent 8 months doing informal range work, not because anyone told him to, because he understood that the math he did in peacetime was the same math that would matter when everything went wrong. He left. Petra sat in her trailer with the February wind pressing against the aluminum walls and looked at her screen for a long time without seeing it. She was at the meeting point the next morning at 05:29. Sherwood said nothing about that. He simply started running. The formal invitation to live fire practice came 10 days later. Not as an order. He was careful about that in a way Petra would only understand much later, the way he had always created space rather than filling it himself. He offered, suggested, told stories about people like LeBeau, and left enough room that the curiosity he'd correctly identified in her could fill the rest on its own terms. The range master at Gagetown, a lean master corporal named Yves Thibodeau, looked at her paperwork and then at her with the expression of a man who has been surprised before and has developed a standard procedure for managing it. Sherwood was standing at the back of the bay with his arms folded. Some wordless conversation passed between them. "Lane 3, Thibodeau said. She fired badly at first. She knew it before he told her. The group scattered. Her breathing wrong, her trigger pull compensating for an anticipated recoil instead of trusting the mechanics. Thibodeau offered corrections in the flat, professionally detached tone of a man who had been doing this long enough to have given up deciding in advance whether someone would improve. She didn't argue with his corrections. She listened to them, implemented what she could, found 3 errors he hadn't named yet, and fixed those too. By the end of the first session, her groups had tightened enough to interest her, if not to impress anyone else. She said nothing about this on the drive back to her section. She updated her thermal drift report. She submitted the corrected variance analysis on the Excalibur rounds. And that evening she lay on her cot in the PMQ she'd been allocated and thought about trigger mechanics the way she thought about ballistic coefficients, as a system with its own internal logic, its own tolerances, its own relationship between input and output that rewarded honest attention. Sherwood found her at her workstation the following Thursday. He sat down in the second chair without being invited, which was unusual enough that she looked up immediately. "You're going to have a rough week soon," he said. "After the first real breakthrough, there's always one. Your analysis instincts will start fighting your muscle memory. You'll go to the range, and the groups will open up, and you'll wonder if everything before it was a fluke." She looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because everyone does. And because you're analytical enough that your brain will make it worse than average. Smart people have a harder time trusting what they can't fully explain yet." He stood up. "When it happens, don't adjust your fundamentals. Go back to breath, position, natural point of aim. The mechanics don't change just because your confidence does." He was exactly right. The rough week came in late March, during a crosswind session at 300 meters. Everything she'd built over 6 weeks dissolved into scattered groups and a tightness behind her sternum that she refused to let become anything louder than that. Thibodeau said nothing, which was somehow the hardest part. She stripped the rifle down and rebuilt it with the meticulous fury she usually reserved for corrupted datasets, and when she raised it again, she found the same problem waiting for her. She set the rifle on the bench. She stood with her hands flat on the surface and looked at the target and held the frustration in her chest without letting it run anywhere useful or useless. Thibodeau appeared at her elbow. He put a range card on the bench without a word, Sherwood's handwriting on it, a simple breathing diagram, the kind of thing she'd been shown in week 1. She picked it up. Then she picked up the rifle. She shot the pattern. It was bad. She shot it again. Still bad. The 4th shot landed within 2 centimeters of her intended point, and something unlocked in her chest that had been compressed since the session started. She shot until the light changed. When she turned around, Sherwood was gone. He had left precisely when she stopped needing him there, which was the most and the least he could have done, and which told her more about the kind of soldier he was than anything he had said directly. Over the following weeks, he introduced movement drills, elevated positions, cold barrel protocols. The first shot from a cold barrel behaved differently from every subsequent one, and the shooter who forgot that paid for it when it mattered most. He ran scenario exercises where he gave her incomplete information and asked her to make decisions anyway, because in the situations that actually required this skill, complete information was a peacetime luxury. The hardest sessions weren't physical. They were the ones where he put scenarios in front of her and asked her to decide, threat or not a threat, shoot or hold, and then told her afterward what information she hadn't been given. "You got that wrong," he said once, flatly, without apology. The posture you read as aggression was a man who'd just been searched at gunpoint 30 seconds before your scope found him. You didn't have that context. You need to get comfortable making decisions without it. And you need to stay humble about the possibility of being wrong, even when your read feels certain. She sat with those sessions longer than any of the others. By the end of week 10, Thibodeau was watching her shoot with his arms folded and his expression doing something complicated. One afternoon, he said to no one in particular, in a voice that was lower than intended, "Sherwood, what are you building over there?" Sherwood didn't answer. Petra heard it. She rebuilt her position from the floor up, the way he'd taught her, and looked through the scope at a target 400 meters out and let the crosswind read itself to her the way data, if you waited long enough and paid close enough attention, eventually did. She pressed the trigger. The round landed where she'd intended. She didn't feel pride. She felt something quieter than pride and more permanent, the specific satisfaction of a skill that had stopped being performed and started simply being. She didn't know yet that in 17 days, on a fire support coordination mission in Kandahar Province, she was going to be the only person in a position to do what needed to be done. At 2100 hours on a Wednesday in November, Sergeant First Class Leo Devereaux walked into the fire support cell with two members of his JTF-2 team and an expression that Petra had learned over 4 months at the forward operating base meant the operational picture had shifted. She kept working. She'd learned early that the right thing to do when operators came in with that expression was to let them get to the point in their own time. Devereaux got to the point immediately. That was one of the things about JTF-2. They didn't spend words. "Vance," he said, "you're on the manifest for Shepard." She set down her stylus slowly. "I'm fire support coordination," she said. "My role is in the cell." "Not tonight." He said it without drama. "We're confirming a cache site in the Argandab. Intelligence says there's a network hub embedded with the storage facility, communications equipment, targeting data, the kind of material that needs on-site assessment to establish what we're actually dealing with. TSOC needs actionable analysis within 20 minutes of breach." He paused. "You're the best person on this base at making sense of technical data under time pressure. We need that skill on the ground." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the two JTF-2 operators behind him. One of them, a compact, still-looking sergeant named Fen Calder, was watching her with the careful neutrality of someone who had been briefed on who she was and was reserving judgment in the specifically professional way of people who had learned that initial assessments were placeholders. "That's Sergeant Calder," Devereaux said. "He's your immediate cover for the duration, 20 meters at all times. You assess the technical cache, you relay the data, you extract with the team." He said it like a checklist. Any questions? She had many. She asked the one that mattered. "Is Sherwood briefed?" "Sherwood briefed me on you," Devereaux said. She absorbed that. Sherwood had never mentioned this possibility. In all the sessions, all the evening conversations on the range bench, all the scenarios where he had asked her to decide with incomplete information, he had said nothing about an operation attached to any of it. She felt something that wasn't quite betrayal and wasn't quite gratitude and occupied the uncomfortable space exactly between them. "Wheels up at 0230, Devereaux said. "Draw your kit from the armory." He turned to go. She stopped him before she'd fully decided to. "The cache," she said. "If it's what you're describing, and the communications equipment is what I think it might be based on the intercepts from the last 3 weeks, you're not looking at a local hub. You're looking at a coordination node for at least 4 separate networks. That changes the assessment framework completely." Devereaux turned back. Something shifted in his expression, the faintest recalibration. "That's exactly why you're coming," he said. He left. Calder remained for a moment after the others had gone. He looked at her with that same careful expression, and then he said, in a voice that was quieter than she'd expected for a man his size, "You ready for this?" She thought about the honest answer. "Ask me in 3 hours, she said. He almost smiled. "Fair enough," he said, and followed Devereaux out. She stood in the fire support cell for 30 seconds after they were gone. Then she went to find her kit. Sherwood was at the armory. Of course he was. He was leaning against the exterior wall with his arms folded and his face doing the thing it rarely did, showing something unmediated. He was worried. He was also certain. Both things were simultaneously true, and she had learned to read the difference between them in his expression the same way she'd learned to read the difference between a variable that needed addressing and one that needed accepting. "You could have told me," she said. "Yes," he said. "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because the moment you knew there was an operation attached to the training, you would have started training for the operation instead of training for competence. They're not the same thing." He pushed off the wall. "Come inside. Thibodeau's got your loadout." She followed him in. "I'm going as fire support analysis," she said. "I'm not a shooter on this mission." "Correct," Sherwood said. "Then why is there?" She stopped when she saw the bench. Her kit was laid out in sequence. Body armor, helmet, radio, night optics, medical. And at the end of the bench, in its case, Thibodeau standing beside it with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not professional detachment, not the reluctant respect of recent weeks. Something that looked like he was trying to decide how he felt about tonight, the C-14 case. "That's not for me," she said. "I'm not the designated shooter." "No," Sherwood said. "You're not." He opened the case. "But Calder is carrying the same system on Overwatch, and nothing is going to happen to Calder's system." He looked at her directly. The armory was warm and close and smelled of solvent and the specific ozone plastic smell of new equipment. Outside, she could hear rotors being run up on the flight line. "Nothing is going to happen to Calder's system," she said, but her voice had already changed on the second, saying, "You know this system," Sherwood said. "You know it better than people who've carried it for twice as long as you've been in uniform. If something changes tonight, if the situation requires something nobody in the TOC can predict right now, I need you capable of making a decision and acting on it." He met her eyes. "I am not telling you to go out there looking for that moment. I'm telling you that the people we call heroes are usually just the people who were prepared when preparation was required." She looked at the rifle, then at Sherwood. "What does your read say about tonight?" He didn't answer immediately. Sherwood never answered questions about his read immediately. When he spoke, he said, "My read says the intelligence on this site is accurate but incomplete. It says the number of fighters protecting it is higher than the aerial count suggests. And it says..." He stopped. "It says tonight matters," he said simply. She nodded. She reached for her body armor and began putting it on. At 0230, she was strapped into the Griffon with Devereaux's team, Sherwood, and a combat medic named Corporal Arnaud Cyr, who had the particular settled calm of someone who had decided a long time ago to make their peace with chaos rather than spend energy being surprised by it. The rotors were loud. The November air through the door was the specific dry cold of the Afghan plateau at altitude. Not the wet cold of New Brunswick winters, but the kind that found gaps in your equipment with the precision of something that had been doing it since before any country on Earth had named this place. Calder was across from her. His C-14 was between his knees. He was looking out at the darkness below with his hands completely still, not the stillness of suppressed tension, but the stillness of someone whose body had learned there was no value in spending resources on anxiety before the moment that required them. Sherwood leaned across the noise and said directly into her ear, "When we land, stay on Calder and do your job. Everything else follows from that." "What if it doesn't?" she said. He sat back and looked at her in the green wash of the aircraft interior. He had the expression of a man who had been in enough situations where things had not followed from the expected sequence to know that the question was fair and the only honest answer was also the only useless one. "Then you'll handle it," he said, flatly as a fact, and somehow that was more steadying than anything else he could have offered. At 0117, the Griffons flared onto a rocky flat 2 kilometers below the objective. The team dismounted with the quiet efficiency of people for whom this transition is as ordinary as stepping off a bus. The aircraft left. The mountains settled around them like a physical presence. The climb took 35 minutes. Sherwood had added elevation work to her conditioning in week 7. She had resented it methodically and was now fiercely grateful. Calder stayed within 15 meters of her, not hovering, present in the specific way of a person who takes a responsibility seriously without performing it. At the objective, Devereaux's lead element breached in under 4 minutes. Petra went in with the second element, and the moment she was inside, a reinforced underground structure cut into the bedrock, its size and configuration immediately telling her things the intelligence photographs had not. She understood two things at once. The first was that she'd been right about the scope of the network. What she was looking at was not a communications hub, it was an archive. Encrypted drives, hard copy coordination documents, equipment serial numbers, financial routing records, the kind of material that could unravel networks for years if the analysis was done right. The second thing she understood was that the radio traffic outside had changed. Not in content, she couldn't track the JTF2 channel clearly, but in frequency and urgency, the particular cadence of communications that shifts when the situation is no longer what it was planned to be. Then the shot, one shot, distant but not distant enough. From the direction of Calder's Overwatch position, 3 seconds later Devereaux's voice came over the net. Overwatch is down. Say again, Overwatch is down. She was moving before the transmission ended. Not a decision. Something below decision, the product of 10 weeks of scenario training that had built a response pattern faster than conscious thought. Calder was 25 meters from the entrance, in a shallow depression with clean lines of sight down the 2 primary approach corridors. He was on his side. His left arm wasn't working. He was conscious, which was the first number she needed. Calder. I'm up, he said through his teeth. The obvious lie necessary. The rifle. Get the rifle up. East corridor, 180 meters. 2-man team, moving to establish a firing position on the breach point. She was already on her knees beside him, already reading the situation. Can you? She started. No, he said. Just the one arm. He looked at her with eyes that were clear and specific. Grant, can you make this shot? She looked at the rifle. She looked at the corridor. She looked at Calder. Her hands were not shaking. Yes, she said. She picked it up. The stock settled against her shoulder with a familiarity that still surprised her when she let herself notice it. The specific geometry of a system she knew, that she had put 10 weeks of careful, imperfect work into knowing. She found the east corridor through the scope. Night optics resolving rock and shadow into readable information. 180 meters. 2 men, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this before, carrying a weapon system between them. Sherwood's voice, not on any radio but in her memory, with the precision of something she'd written down. The decision to shoot or hold will stay with you. Not the shot, the decision. She made the decision. The first shot broke clean. The weapon system never reached its intended position. She was already scanning. 1 confirmed threat eliminated, 1 unaccounted. The second man had broken from cover in the direction Sherwood's scenario training had specifically predicted. The human instinct to flee a fixed position, which converted a static target into a moving one, but paradoxically into a more visible one. She led him by the correct amount. The second shot landed. 2 confirmed, she said. Sears' voice came over the channel then, steady as a diagnostic report. Calder is stable. Vance, what's your status? She had no status that could be reported in the terms his question was equipped to handle. Her status was lying in a sniper position at 2 in the morning on an Afghan mountain with a JTF2 rifle she had not been authorized to carry and 14 enemy fighters still in the operational environment. Working, she said. Sherwood's voice, actual radio, not memory. He had broken protocol to transmit directly from the TOC, which meant the situation warranted it. Vance, north approach. They're pushing a flanking element toward the breach point. You have a sight line from your current position. Tell me what you see. She shifted. She found the north approach, a narrow channel between 2 rock formations that made movement predictable once you saw it. I see them, she said. 7 moving in pairs. Lead pair is 60 meters from the breach. Can you slow them? She thought about what slow them down meant. She thought about it for exactly the amount of time the situation permitted. Yes, she said. What happened in the next 9 minutes, she would account for afterward in the terms she had. Precise, sequential, without embellishment. She took 4 shots. 3 achieved their intended effect. 1 missed because the target changed direction at the moment of trigger break. She corrected immediately and did not waste time on the miss because the miss was already in the past and the past was not where the situation was. The north approach stalled. 7 people moving in coordinated pairs. When the coordination is disrupted by accurate fire from an unexpected position, do not continue to move in coordinated pairs. They stop. They seek cover. They try to locate the source. They communicate. The communication takes time. Devereaux used the time. At 0251, she heard the sound she had been tracking toward without knowing it. The rotors of 2 CF-18 escorted helicopters arriving from the south, their presence immediately reordering every calculation the enemy element had been running. The north approach collapsed. The flanking attempt broke contact entirely. At 0314, Devereaux called all clear. Petra was still in her position. She had not moved from it for 27 minutes. She became aware, in the silence that followed, that her face was wet. She reached up. She didn't know when that had happened, whether it was after the first shot or somewhere in the 9 minutes, when she had been so completely inside the work that her body had been doing things without consulting her. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist. She cleared the rifle. She set the safety. She lay in the cold mountain air and looked at the sky, which was immense and dark and scattered with stars in the way of high altitude and total indifference. Cyr appeared. She heard him before she saw him, the specific deliberate movement of someone who understood what this moment was. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. He crouched down, did the medic assessment, visible and otherwise. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He sat down beside her and said nothing, just sat. And the simple, uncomplicated presence of another person in the dark was exactly what was needed and the only thing that could have been. "You did something tonight," he said, eventually. "I know what I did," she said. "Yeah," he was quiet for a moment. "I know you do. That's the part that matters. Some people don't let themselves know." He paused. "You're going to know it clearly and you're going to carry it, but you also kept that breach point open. You kept 7 people alive tonight. Maybe more. That's a number 2. She was quiet. The stars were very bright. The mountain was very cold. "Sherwood told me," she said finally, "that the carrying is the work." Cyr looked at her. "He's right," he said. "He almost always is. Doesn't mean the rest of it wasn't worth doing." Below them, she could hear the JTF-2 team working the objective, the systematic professional sound of people executing a task correctly. She could hear Caldervoy's voice somewhere, arguing with Cyr's earlier assessment of his arm, which she took as a reliable indicator. She sat up. She picked up the rifle. She carried it down the mountain herself. Nobody reached for it during the descent. The team moved around her with the quiet professional efficiency of people who had updated their understanding of her somewhere on that ridgeline and were not making a performance of having done so. It was its own kind of acknowledgement, not a ceremony, just the wordless adjustment of people who dealt in reality and revised it when the evidence required. At Fob Griffin, Sherwood was at the edge of the flight line when she crossed it. She stopped 2 paces from him. They looked at each other in the pale wash of the perimeter lights. "You knew," she said. "I assessed," he said. "That's not the same as knowing." "No," she said, "it's not." Looked at the rifle, then at her face. He was reading, the same reading he'd done since the first morning run, seeing the dried tracks, the quality of her stillness, the way she was carrying the system, not clutching it, not distancing herself from it. "How are you?" he said. She thought about giving him the same answer she'd given Cyr. She decided Sherwood deserved a more precise version. "I'm functional," she said. "I'm going to be something other than functional later. I know that, and I'm going to deal with it. Right now I'm functional." He nodded. The single nod that meant he had received the information and found it accurate and complete. "Come find me when later gets here," he said. The debrief lasted 2 hours and was conducted by a lieutenant colonel named Hartwell, who consumed information the way some people breathe, continuously and without interruption. He wanted everything: the technical cache assessment, the shot sequence, the decision process, the specific observable data that had preceded each trigger break. She gave him all of it in the same framework she used for ballistic analysis: input conditions, calculation, output, variance from expected. When she finished, Hartwell was quiet for a moment. "Corporal Vance," he said, "your primary role on this operation was technical assessment." "Yes, sir. You are not a designated marksman. You have not attended sniper school. You have no operational live-fire record." "No, sir. And yet your shot data is consistent with someone who has all 3. He looked at his notes. 3 confirmed, 1 miss with immediate correction. East approach neutralized, north approach stalled, 7 personnel accounted for. At ranges between 160 and 310 meters. At night. Under direct fire. On a first operational deployment outside the wire. He set the notes down. Chief Warrant Officer Sherwood has submitted documentation of your informal training program. I've reviewed it. It is thorough and it is honest, and it explains some of what I'm looking at tonight. He paused. You'll be recommended for the Chief of Defense Staff Commendation. That recommendation will go to Brigade for review. I expect it to be approved. Another pause. That's not what you need to hear right now. What you need to hear is that what you did tonight was preparation meeting circumstance. The Canadian forces recognize that. He looked at her steadily. Dismissed, Corporal. Get some rest. She was halfway to the door when he said, Vance. She turned. The network you identified tonight. The routing records you flagged in the first 7 minutes on site. Hartwell's voice was level and careful. Our intelligence section has been trying to establish that supply chain for 11 months. He paused. I thought you should know. She held that. Then she nodded and walked out. She sat on a concrete barrier outside the TOC and watched the sky go from black to the dark specific blue that comes before color. She thought about 11 months of somebody else's work. She thought about Calder's arm and the way he had spoken to her in the fire support cell. Ask me in 3 hours. With the complete directness of a man who respected people enough to tell them the truth, she thought about Sherwood saying, tonight matters in the armory with the flatness of a statement rather than a prediction. She sat for 40 minutes. She didn't cry. She'd already done that without deciding to on the mountain, and that had been the correct amount. What she did instead was something quieter. An internal reconciliation. The specific discipline of holding 2 true things at once. The weight of what she had done and the necessity of it, and letting them exist together without forcing them into something simpler than they were. Sherwood had said the carrying was the work. She was beginning to understand the full scope of what that meant. At 0700, she went to find Calder. He was in the medical bay with his left arm immobilized and his color better than she had expected given what she'd seen on the ridgeline. Sear was reviewing his chart. He gave her a look that meant, come in. He's been asking about you. Delivered with the economy of someone who has learned to make facial expressions do the work of full sentences. Calder watched her cross the bay with an expression that was different from anything she'd seen on him before. The operational stillness was gone. He just looked at her. I heard the debrief numbers, he said. The debrief was classified. I heard the relevant parts. He said it without apology. 3 confirmed. East approach clear in under 45 seconds. North approach stalled for 9 minutes while Devereaux repositioned. He held her gaze. I want to say something and I'd like you to hear it the way it's meant. She waited. I have been on 14 operational deployments, he said. I have had my survival depend on someone else's skill exactly 5 times. Tonight was one of them. He said it with the flat specificity of a man who keeps a precise count and does not round up. You belong in a sniper program, Vance, not in a fire support trailer. What you do with that is yours to decide. But I needed to say it clearly. She stood with that for a moment. Then she said, how's the arm? He made a face. Sear is catastrophizing. You have a partial separation at the acromioclavicular joint and a hematoma the size of a regulation puck, Sear said from across the room without looking up. It's fine, Calder said. She almost laughed. It surprised her. The quick upward movement of something that had been compressed since the mountain and needed somewhere to go. She let it come out as a smile, and Calder saw it, and something in his expression settled in the way of a person who had been quietly worried about something, and now wasn't. She stayed 20 minutes. Then she went to find Sherwood. He was in his section office, a partitioned space in the operations building, furnished with a field desk, a map board, 2 chairs, and the particular dense organization of a man who has spent 3 decades making inadequate space sufficient. He was writing something when she came in and put the C-14 case on his desk. He looked at the case, then at her. He put down his pen. You submitted documentation of the training, she said. Yes. Why? Because the record needed to reflect what actually happened tonight, he said. The Army will look for the simplest explanation. The simplest explanation would have been luck, or adrenaline, or a statistical anomaly. I wanted the documentation to show that it was preparation, an exceptional natural ability that the preparation gave a context to. She sat down in the second chair. He didn't say anything about that. Hartwell told me about the supply chain, she said. 11 months of intelligence work. Sherwood said nothing. Did you know that before the operation? I knew the cash was significant, he said carefully. I didn't know the specific scope Hartwell referenced. He looked at her. Does it change anything for you? She thought about it honestly. It doesn't make it simpler, she said, but it belongs in the full accounting, and I need the full accounting. Sherwood nodded slowly. That's the right answer. Not the comfortable one, the right one. They sat in the quiet for a moment. Outside, the base was waking up. Engines, voices, the ordinary machinery of a day that had no interest in the fact that last night had happened. Devereaux wants to talk to me, she said. I know, said Sherwood. You know what he's going to say? I have a reasonable assessment. He was being careful. She could hear it. The same care he always took, making space rather than filling it. He's going to offer me a choice, she said, between going back to fire support coordination and something else. Sherwood said nothing. And you're not going to tell me what to choose, she said. No, why not? Because it has to be yours. The training was mine to design. The preparation was mine to run. But what you do with who you are, that belongs entirely to you. The moment I make that decision for you, even partially, you'll carry it differently. You'll carry it like an obligation. An obligation is the wrong weight to bring into a situation that requires clarity. She sat with that. At 10:00 hours, she walked into Devereaux's office and sat across from him. He looked at her with the directness she had identified as his defining characteristic. He did not approach things obliquely. Vance, he said, I'm not going to dress this up. Last night you demonstrated a capability that is rare and that this organization does not have properly documented or resourced. In 15 years of operations, I have seen the kind of tactical composure you showed last night in approximately 10 people. That is an assessment, not flattery. He folded his hands. You have two options. Option 1, you return to your fire support role. Last night is documented as an exceptional circumstance. You receive the commendation and you finish your tour doing the job you came here to do. There is no shame in that. You are excellent at it and it matters. He paused. Option 2, I submit a recommendation to Canadian Special Operations Forces Command for your candidacy in the sniper qualification course at CFB Gagetown. The recommendation will include my assessment, Calder's assessment, Sherwood's documentation, and the operational record from last night. Given what that record contains, I believe the application will be approved. She had known this was coming. She had known it on the mountain. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes. Why does it matter to you? You're JTF too. This is a Canadian Army program. Why are you involved in what I do next? He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, because Calder would have died last night if you hadn't picked up that rifle. And Calder is the best Overwatch I have worked with in a decade. The person who kept him alive deserves to be in a position where her skill is fully used and fully supported. He paused. And because I made a decision a long time ago that when I see someone who belongs in this work, I say so clearly, without qualification. I'm saying so. She looked at her hands. She thought about Sudbury and her father's engineering notebooks, and the particular patience of a man who had taught her that the most important calculation was the one you didn't rush. She thought about Sherwood saying, tonight matters in the armory. She thought about Sear on the mountain, that's a number 2, and the specific weight of Calder's count, 5 times in 14 deployments. She thought about what she was afraid of. She made herself name it the way Sherwood had trained her to name errors, not to punish herself, but to address them honestly. She was afraid of becoming someone she didn't fully recognize yet. She was afraid of the carrying, the permanent, non-correctable weight of decisions that could not be revised in the next calculation cycle. She was afraid that the woman who modeled artillery trajectories and called her father's old number on Sunday evenings and kept a notebook of ballistic variables was going to be altered in ways that didn't have a return path. And then she understood. She was already altered. Last night had already done the irreversible thing. The question was not whether she was the person who had done what she'd done on that mountain. She was. The question was only what she was going to do about it. She looked up. I'd like to speak with Seer before I give you an answer. Devereaux nodded. Take the time you need. My recommendation stands regardless of when you come back. She found Seer finishing discharge paperwork in the medical bay, and she told him what Devereaux had offered and what she was afraid of. Not the managed version she'd given the debrief, but the actual one, the version she had named to herself in the corridor outside Devereaux's office and was now saying out loud for the first time. Seer listened, genuinely listened, the kind that holds what it receives instead of waiting for its turn. When she finished, he said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "On the ridgeline, before the first shot, in the decision, what did it feel like?" She thought about it. "Clear," she said finally. "Everything complicated simplified down to exactly what it needed to be." "Why did that scare you?" "Because it should have been harder." He shook his head. "Petra." He almost never used first names. "It felt clear because you were prepared." The clarity wasn't the absence of conscience. It was conscience and competence and necessity and alignment. That's exactly what a person in that position is supposed to feel. The fear you're feeling right now, the weight, the doubt, that's your conscience working. That's healthy. The two things aren't contradictions. They're both part of the same moral seriousness. A person who felt nothing afterward would concern me. You're not that person. She sat with that. Then she asked the question she had come to ask. If it were you, if Devereaux had offered you this choice. Seer looked at her steadily. "I became a medic," he said, "because I understood that I could save lives. Specifically, concretely, because I had a skill and the skill was needed, and walking away from it was not something I could justify to myself." He paused. "You already know what the answer is. You came here to have someone confirm it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she stood up. She went back to Devereaux's office. She knocked on the open door. He looked up. "Submit the recommendation," she said. He nodded. "Once clean. Congratulations, Corporal," he said. "You just made the harder choice." She walked out into the corridor and stood in the operational noise of a forward base going about its ordinary business, completely indifferent to the fact that she had just become, in some irreversible way, a different version of herself. Somewhere in the medical bay, Calder was losing an argument about his own injury. Somewhere in a section office, Sherwood was writing something in his precise, economical handwriting. Somewhere in Sudbury, a house sat empty and patient in the November cold, her father's engineering notebooks still on the shelf above the desk, his handwriting on the margins of pages she had read so many times she could see them with her eyes closed. She went back to the fire support cell. She sat down. She opened her workstation, and the data was all there, exactly as she'd left it, waiting with the absolute reliability of numbers that require nothing from you except accuracy. She updated the Excalibur variance analysis. She cross-referenced the serial numbers from the cache against the supply chain irregularities she'd been tracking for 3 months, and the connections that emerged were significant enough that she wrote a separate analytical memo and flagged it for intelligence review. She did her job, and when she finished, she closed the screen and sat in the quiet and held both things at once. The woman who calculated where shells would land, and the woman who had looked through a scope in the dark and made the only decision the situation permitted. She let them be the same person. They were the same person. They had always been the same person. The only thing that had changed was that she knew it now. The recommendation reached Consofcom in 72 hours. The approval came back in 14 days. Sherwood walked into the fire support cell without knocking, which he never did, and put a single page on her desk beside her keyboard without a word. She looked at it. CFB Gagetown, Sniper Qualification Course, Class 12 Bravo. Report date, 38 days. She read it twice. Then she looked up at Sherwood. His face was doing the thing it had done on the flight line after Shepard, the unmediated thing, the one that lived underneath the professional composure. He was not smiling, exactly. The closest word she would ever find for what his expression was doing was settled, like a man who had been carrying a hypothesis for a long time and had finally received the evidence that let him set it down. 38 days, she said. 38 days, he confirmed. She looked at the paper again, at the official header, the authorizing signatures, the formal language that turned a decision she had made in a corridor into orders with the full weight of the institution behind them. There was something about official print that made it real in a way the decision itself had not quite been. The decision had been hers, interior. This paper was the institution saying, "We see what you are and we are going to act on it." "I need to call my father's sister," she said. "She's been the one keeping the house." Sherwood picked up the paper, folded it once, handed it back. "Yes," he said. "You do." He turned to leave. "Master Warrant Officer," she said. He turned back. "Thank you," she said, "for the invitation." He looked at her for a moment. "You did the work," he said. "I just opened the range card." He left. She sat in the fire support cell with the paper in her hands and the data on the screen and the specific weight of the C-14 in her muscle memory, and she understood that these things were not separate from each other. The calculations, the rifle, the mountain, the decision, the paper, they were all entries in the same ledger. And the ledger was hers, not as a debt, not as an obligation, but as a record of what she had chosen to become. She picked up her notebook. She opened it to the last page she had written on, the night she had first grouped inside 5 centimeters at 400 meters, and written simply, "The data does not lie." She uncapped her pen. Below it, she wrote the date. She wrote, "Approved, ready." She closed the notebook. She was.